So today I want to talk about a verse in the Ilwan Song, which I missed completely while I was cleaning up, uh, that has been helpful to my practice. It's the part that says, through the way we use our minds and bodies in the four forms of birth, we transform through the six realms of existence, progressing or regressing, with grace arising from harm or harm from grace. To me, in a few lines, Soda-san captures so much about the concept of karma. He's really saying that through the way that we treat other people and really ourselves too, we go in a direction, or it shapes the direction we go in our lives in terms of either developing grace or developing harm. And while I was thinking about this presentation, I was thinking it's not like it's a fork in the road and you go one way or the other way. I think for most of us, it's a zigzag where we're going back and forth, and hopefully practice helps us make us more of a sine wave, you know. And master's probably going a straight line, but I'm hoping for a sine wave. I want to particularly focus on the line that says, grace arising from harm or harm from grace. Buddhism is full of paradoxes, and Buddha talked a lot about the importance of cause and effect in a lot of sutras. But in other places, he talked about there really isn't cause and effect, and that it's more that certain conditions come together and things arise rather than an entity causing another entity to change. And so he correctly, in the Ilwan Song verse, talks about grace arising from harm or harm arising from grace. But for me, I've misheard this line over the years, and I think of it as taking grace from harm or taking harm from grace. And so he obviously has a deeper understanding, but the reason I think it's useful sometimes to think about, do we take grace from harm or do we take harm from grace? So it helps us to become more responsible for our actions and our lives. And in some ways it gets us, I think, participating more actively in our own practice to think about that, or it's helped me to think, am I taking grace from this situation or am I taking harm from the situation? Soda-san used the metaphor of a cauldron to talk about karma, and I think it's a very fitting metaphor. He said that for most of us, we try to change a behavior for a while and then we fall back into old habits. And that's like taking a ladle of water and putting it on top of the cauldron. It doesn't have much of an effect. But that, he said, real change happens when you remove the logs from, that are causing the fire underneath the cauldron. And that's a way of talking about working on changing our intentions. And actually, he talked about both are important, that it's important to work on our actions, but it's also important to think about what are our intentions. And one reason I think this is a very useful or apt metaphor is that if you think about the things that cause problems in our lives, it's really a lot of times anger and anxiety and fear and other hot emotions. So the cauldron, I think, is very fitting. And in terms of Soda-san talking about working on both actions and intentions, that resonates for me with Buddha's Eightfold Path when he talks about right intentions, right speech, and right actions. And it's interesting in a way that in the Eightfold Path, 3, in fact, 4 of the 8 qualities are really focused on karma in a lot of ways. The 4th one being right livelihood, but it's our actions and what we do. So actually, I'm going to reverse the order and talk about what we do that causes harm from grace or takes harm from grace rather than, and then talk about what kinds of things take grace from harm. Buddha particularly gave attention to what he called the three poisons: anger, greed, and delusion. And I think anger is certainly one of the hot emotions I was talking about before that causes a lot of situations where we take harm from grace. So I'm going to talk about a few examples of those. Um, often in our 20s and 30s, we're very preoccupied with finding a partner, either getting married or having a long-term relationship. And we worry about that a lot. And then we find somebody and we fall in love and we're very happy. But after a while, we fall into old patterns and we take the person for granted a little, which maybe it's not even taking for granted. It's just things become normalized. It's not exciting anymore. And we fall into old patterns. And some of those patterns can involve how we express our anger. And so some people, all couples argue and fight, but some couples fight more than others. And some people get angry easier than others. And I guess whether you get angry easier or not, it doesn't matter so much. It's like, what do you do with your anger? And, but we all have things that irritate us or get us annoyed, and we can get angry. Sometimes people get angry easily because they grew up in a family where their parents fought all the time. And in some ways, that's their internal model of this is how relationships are. So it's, why not just let it rip when you feel angry? Other people may have grown up feeling criticized a lot, and they're actually very sensitive to being criticized. So they are also in some ways walking around tense and primed for being criticized. And then when a partner just doesn't like something, disagrees, or is disappointed, the person may feel attacked and then overreact. And so when you get angry and you know you're overreacting, that's certainly a way of taking harm from grace. And if you do this a lot over time, that can kind of corrode or certainly take away from the potential that you can have from a close relationship of somebody understanding you, somebody being affectionate, somebody you can trust. It pushes the other person away and it detracts from the experience for yourself. Often when we're angry, there's an underlying anxiety underneath the anger. So that one of the problems with anger is it's kind of a loud emotion, so that it drowns out any other emotions. And I think one thing that's useful about getting a handle on your anger is to ask yourself, what am I feeling in addition to the anger? The anger may be real, but it drowns out other feelings. And if you can say, what am I feeling under it? Sometimes a lot of it is anxiety. So you may feel there's a disagreement with you and your partner, and the anxiety underneath it is arguments lead to conflicts, and conflicts lead to a relationship ending. And so you actually are anticipating any disagreement is going to lead to being rejected or abandoned. So that's your anxiety, but you kind of cover it up by being angry, because a lot of times for a lot of people, they feel stronger or more empowered when they're angry. So they'd rather feel their anger than their anxiety. I mean, this isn't thought out, it's just kind of automatic. And so as I say, some of the, in some ways, underlying sadness of all this is that you're pushing away the very thing you want. And so that is taking harm from grace. And you're actually taking harm from grace for the other person also. Sometimes anger can have a more complicated function. So some people both long for a close relationship. They want to be understood, they want to be accepted. But at the same time, there's a fear that if somebody really gets to know them, they won't like what they see and they'll reject the person. And so then that creates a kind of push-pull inside where you want to get close, but you also want to protect yourself. So somebody who's like that, who is in a long-term relationship, in some ways can only tolerate so much closeness. So they start to get close and then they get anxious without really maybe realizing it again. And then they find something to argue about, which is a way of pushing the person away. But in some ways, it's a way of regulating the amount of closeness in the relationship. it's like they can only tolerate a certain amount of closeness. So again, that's a way of certainly reducing the grace you can get from a close relationship. In Buddhism, a lot of attention is paid to the negative effects of anger and fear. But there's not so much of a discussion about how depression can affect creating harm from grace, or can affect our karmic actions and our karmic path, so to speak. Depression can be thought of kind of as a ongoing sadness that doesn't subside, and then it becomes just part of a baseline part of your personality. And many people who are depressed have feelings of loneliness, feel kind of cut off from other people, feel somewhat nobody can really understand them. So sometimes when people are depressed, they literally walk out in the street and are looking down at the sidewalk because they're kind of having a lot of thoughts in their head and they're preoccupied with their depression. And this is, I think, a literal kind of experience where you walking down the street looking down, you can't see a neighbor who might recognize you and smile at you, or you can't see somebody who wants to flirt with you. You're actually missing opportunities. And I think this idea of like going through life with your head down, so to speak, could be a metaphor for a lot of other situations where when you're depressed, you may not see opportunities that are available. So you may not see, again, people who want to reach out and be friends. You may not see at work even. You may walk around protecting yourself, so you come across as aloof and people don't approach you, and you're actually worried about whether people like you, so that you're pushing people away without realizing it. Or even a supervisor or manager gives you a compliment, and a lot of times when you're depressed, you have low self-esteem, so you can't take it in and you push it aside, and that stops from connecting with somebody who could maybe be a mentor or certainly open up growth opportunities and development, both in your career as a career ladder, but even more importantly, helping you learn to get better at whatever you're doing. When somebody who's depressed is in a long-term relationship, they can also have trouble connecting with their partner, so that they, again, the feelings of going around for a long time in their life, maybe feeling that nobody really understands them or that they're alone, can make it hard to really connect when somebody is wanting to understand them and is there. So in some ways, somebody who's depressed may either not fully take in their partner's affection and love and let them, in some ways, digest it. They take it in, it feels good, but they don't really kind of digest it so that they start to feel safer or more trusting in the relationship. And they may be withdrawn at times and not as available to connect as they could. And so again, that's another way of taking harm from grace. So in terms of taking grace from harm, I think taking grace from harm really starts with our meditation and mindfulness practice. That's kind of the foundation of taking grace from harm. I think through my own experience that meditating over a period of years helps to decrease the level of anger and anxiety you feel inside. I don't have any studies for this, but I think that there's really, or could be anyway, a neurological kind of rewiring in our brains. And that, so for me, I find over the years I have less anger or anxiety to cope with. And then mindfulness also helps me cope with it better. And mindfulness, I think, can be applied to all the examples of taking harm from grace that I talked about. Because when we're mindful, the first step of mindfulness is observing what we're doing and how we're reacting. And so if we can start to observe, oh, I overreacted there, then we can start to think, oh, how can I change that? And that happens gradually. And maybe you have to observe it a lot of times before you start catching it. But I think mindfulness involves both observing a behavior that doesn't work or that has got negative effects both for yourself and for other people, and then asking yourself, what is a more thoughtful, reasonable, compassionate way to act? And obviously, trying to develop those kinds of ways of acting over time decreases the amount of negative karmic actions you're taking, but also uh, starts decreasing harm and increasing grace. So in terms of the examples I gave about getting angry, sometimes we get angry and we just assume, of course, that got me angry, and we don't question much. But different people get angry for different things. Different things set people off. And then there's also the degree that you get angry. So sometimes after you get angry, it's useful to ask yourself, why did I get so angry at that? Is there something about this interaction that hits a sensitive nerve for me? So did I feel rejected by somebody? Did I feel somebody was condescending? And why does condescending gets to me more than somebody teasing me or something? And asking ourselves, what what is the meaning we're assigning to somebody else's negative behavior or annoying behavior? Tells us something about our own sensitive nerves and issues. And sometimes if we realize, oh, okay, I may be sensitive to feeling criticized, then I start to think, oh, the person out there is not so much the threat. It's my own feeling that I deserve to be criticized or accepting that. And if I start to feel like, oh, I don't have to be so defensive when I get criticized. We all make mistakes. So it's okay to make a mistake. And sometimes I can also disagree with the other person's opinion of me. They may be critical, but I can have my own opinion. Working with your own criticism makes the action of the other person less threatening. So that's a way of, I think, using mindfulness. Going back to relationships, a lot of people have a lot of anxiety about conflict. And so sometimes when their partner gets critical, because you can't be in a relationship and not get critical of your partner. A certain amount of criticism is just normal. But some people fear that criticism is going to lead to conflict, which is going to lead to separation. And so they overreact because they're really worried about being rejected. And they either get angry at feeling rejected, or they even beat the person to the punch and say, well, the relationship's over, when the other person wasn't thinking that at all. I've heard Reverend Park in several Dharma talks use the phrase taking a pause. And I think that's a really very useful tool to think about how to take grace from harm. If we just give ourselves a pause to not react right away, that can many times help us kind of catch ourselves, get a little calmer, and react in a more reasonable or thoughtful way. And in some ways, the idea of a pause leads to me to the larger idea of patience and trying to cultivate patience. Being able to be patient when we start to feel anxious and out of control in a situation helps to recenter ourselves so that we can respond in a more thoughtful way. Being patient when somebody else is feeling angry is also a way of being able to realize that the other person has their own stresses and their own anxieties and their own sensitive issues, and they may be getting defensive themselves. But if you can be patient with that, you can both be less overreactive to it, but also giving the other person some space. They probably will calm down, and so I think patience sometimes kind of naturally leads to more empathy. If you feel a little bit more patient and calm, you can empathize with somebody else's difficulties and then show them some consideration or some empathy. I used to think that it was very important for me to stick up for myself in my relationship with my wife. And if she was critical or annoyed or acting a little tense, as we all do as human beings, I have to push back and assert myself and say that's not fair and be critical back. And then that would cause an argument. And so more recently, I have found, maybe just where my practice is unfolding, that I don't react as much if she gets critical or annoyed in those moments. And this is not to say that my wife is a critical person. She's very not, she really isn't. She's a very calm person most of the time. But I've noticed recently that if she does get annoyed or critical, or I feel demanding about something, I'm not reactive as much. And then in like 10 minutes, she usually comes and apologizes to me because she realizes she overreacted and the situation doesn't escalate. And that's kind of an example. I feel better about how I handled the situation and things go better between us. It just goes by. Another quality that I think helps take grace from harm is the quality of generosity. And generosity is something that has, I think, a wide range of applications. So generosity can be a small action like getting somebody a cup of tea or a cup of water or picking up a small gift on the way home that you know somebody needs. But generosity can be also volunteering and giving your time to people, or certainly giving your time even without volunteering, but just giving your time to a coworker, to a family member or friend. Um, and then there's also what I think of as developing a generosity of spirit, where you kind of develop a certain sense of giving the other person the benefit of the doubt and extend a certain kindness towards somebody, so that when they're, again, irritable or they're having a bad day, you don't jump and say they're treating you unfairly. You give them the benefit of the doubt that something must be going on with them, because most of the time they're a good person. And so to me, in that moment, it's kind of like patience, but it's also different. It's giving some generosity and kindness to the other person. I think often in our close relationships, there can be a kind of competition, or people feel there's a limited amount of love and attention that can go around. And so that people can kind of feel like there's a little bit of a push and pull about they have to stick up and be vigilant to get their amount of attention in a relationship. And that causes this kind of tit for tat. And I think generosity goes into saying, hey, there's enough for everybody here. And if I'm not getting mine right now, I can put my needs to the side and maybe concentrate on my partner because something's going on with him or her that is out of the norm. They're having a bad day, or maybe something happened at work that they're bringing home that they're upset about that they haven't told me yet. And that act of generosity, I think the other person usually appreciates that and then wants to reciprocate. And that develops a more positive cycle in a relationship rather than a negative one. So karma is often discussed in terms of its long-term effects. You know, there's a phrase, karmic seeds, that has to do with you plant karmic seeds and they may take a long time to come to fruition or to come to consequences. And in Buddhism, that means lifetimes away, you know, so that we're all dealing with difficult situations from prior lifetimes, which happens to drive me crazy because I think that's very unfair, but that's the idea of karma. But I think in some ways, when we practice mindfulness and patience and generosity, that then we experience more of a sense of centeredness and compassion and kindness. And in that way, I think that's a way of taking grace from harm in our present lives, and is a way of maybe generating better karma even in the present life. Thank you.